we need to do impression management all the time. We need to do impression management when we are in a face-to-face meeting, when we are on a Zoom meeting, when we are on social media. And now we add the metaverse.
Hey there, you're listening to Delve, the podcast from McGill University where we want to change how you think about management. My name is Eric Dicaire, and I'm Delve's managing editor. So the voice that you just heard is Emma Vaast, Professor of Information Systems here at McGill University and the Associate Dean of Research at the Dicaire Faculty of Management. And in that clip, she's talking about something that you may not have thought about in a while, metaverses. So these days, AI is the hot new piece of tech on the block, but that doesn't mean metaverses have disappeared. Immersive, virtual realities are being used to train pilots and surgeons. Management students are taking virtual field trips to factories around the world, and one day, communicating through VR may be as common as taking a Zoom call. And if that happens, what does that mean for how we work? What happens when we present ourselves through customized avatars rather than a true image of ourselves? Can VR facilitate more personal, meaningful connections between coworkers, or will it just be a new way to monitor workers and absorb them into the surveillance economy? So that's what Professor Vaast and I are discussing in today's interview. Let's delve into it. Well, Professor Emma Vaast, welcome to the show. So I'm really excited you're here because I fancy myself as a bit of a tech nerd. Like, I enjoy thinking about technology and how it affects the world and the way we live and the way that we work. And, last time you were on the show, you talked about how tech shapes occupational identity, which I thought was very interesting. And I guess that kind of aligns with what we're going to talk about today, because we're actually going to be talking about metaverses, which I find really fascinating. And I think there's a lot to get into. So I don't know. I guess my first question to you is just in a world that's dominated by AI, I feel like all I'm doing is writing about and thinking about AI these days. Why study metaverses at all?
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much, Eric. And clearly AI is, it's a headline. Everybody's talking about it. We're thinking a lot about AI these days because it's changing work. It's changing the process of work. It's changing the output of work. It's making us question a lot of things. But metaverses are also starting to operate. They're being used. There's a lot of situated uses around metaverses. So even though they are not the headline, they are still quite important. And they can have a big impact onto not just how we do work, but how we experience work.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So you're saying that they're in use right now? Because that's really interesting. Can you give me some examples?
Yes, they are in use from now. So I'm sure most people are familiar with metaverses in terms of immersive platforms in gaming. So, in gaming, immersive platforms are absolutely everywhere. In the world of work, they are actually used, but in a much more uneven way. So it's not today, it's not tomorrow that people are going to be working 24/7 or 8 hours a day with an immersive platform. But there are there are pockets of use that are very intense. And there are certain contexts in which metaverses can be particularly useful in the case of onboarding employees who cannot be there physically yet. This is a good use of metaverses. Another big use of metaverses is for training. So there's a lot of immersive platforms for surgeons, for instance. So they're going to be putting their VR glasses and they're going to be starting to do surgery. Now, obviously, it's not surgery on a real person, but it is an environment that is simulated and that is almost augmented reality that is so precise and so clear that they can really learn how to do the surgery without having necessarily to yet perform on a person. There can also be uses of metaverses for collaboration, where you would have people who are co-located in the same room for a certain amount of time, and other people who for many reasons may not be in the same room. So you could have a mixed reality meeting with some people in the same room and other people who join via the the platform, and this could help them feel more included. And when you have collaboration that is complex collaboration, that can be particularly helpful.
Wow, that's really interesting. Well, that'll make Zoom meetings a whole lot more interesting if you can actually like engage with the person in 3 dimensions. That's
Exactly. So now, obviously, metaverses so far, metaverses for work have encountered a bit of an uncanny valley. You've probably seen Meta being a little bit criticized or even mocked for its avatars that were missing legs. So there was this idea that, well, the metaverse doesn't seem so exciting. I don't like Zoom, but at least I can recognize my colleagues. The pace of innovation in immersive platforms is extremely high. And so this uncanny valley aspect is likely to be overcome fairly fast.
Yeah, that's interesting. And have you tried it before?
Yeah, I've had a couple of experiences. Clearly, the idea is not to replicate what's happening in a regular face-to-face, physical socio-material interaction. But there is something very interesting about being able to create a sense of proximity, regardless of geographical proximity. And the potentials are very interesting. So again, I don't think it's going to drastically change the way we work, the way we do meetings, face-to-face meetings, Zoom meetings, whatever format they have are there to stay. But I think it's likely that the innovation in immersive platform will be such that there might be more coming up in the future.
Wow, that's really interesting. So, obviously, this has so many implications for just like what it means to be a person and how to interact with each other. So we already have one layer right now where, like if we're using Facebook or Instagram or any other of these social media platforms, like it's already a very flattened experience, like human experience. And it's kind of turning all these social interactions into these data points that can be commodified and farmed for advertising purposes. And so when I think of the metaverse, I think about that, but just like, just like amplified to the nth degree. But you looked at this in the workplace. What makes a metaverse work oriented versus something that's more social or gaming oriented, for example?
Mm-hmm. I think this is a fantastic question. I will try to address it first by saying that it's exhausting to be a worker in 2026. No matter what, it's exhausting, right? We need to do impression management all the time. We need to do impression management when we are in a face-to-face meeting, when we are on a Zoom meeting, when we are on social media. And now we add the metaverse. We add yet another context. And this is a very particular context, very different in terms of the way in which we present ourselves. That is very, very different. I am not saying that it's necessarily all bad. I think it can go in many different directions. The optimistic part of me is thinking, well, the metaverse is great in some way because it enables everyone to have access. I can be working from Montreal and being in the same virtual room as somebody who is in Africa, in India, in Australia, and we are all on the same page. So the access is really interesting. I can also customize my avatar in a way that feels more me, if I feel comfortable doing so. If the environment of the organization makes it that it's actually okay to do so. So there's this idea that theoretically, at least, on the metaverse, I could be anyone I feel inside to be. Meanwhile, when I'm in a meeting in person, I am this particular person and this gender, this age, this particular physical attributes that I don't need to be on the metaverse. So that's the optimistic part of me. The slightly less optimistic part of me is thinking about how exhausting it already is to be a worker today with all of these digital technologies, and then we add one. And also the fact that we need to learn how to act appropriately and to know what to do on the metaverse. It's not going to be easy. It's not self-explanatory. And the last point is, I think, a point that you maybe alluded to a little bit in your question, which is on the metaverse, suddenly I'm here and I'm very visible. Everybody can see where I'm here, when I'm not here. So it's just yet another data point, another element where everybody talks about the surveillance economy. There's a risk with the metaverse that the surveillance economy takes it yet another level up and becomes even more difficult for workers.
Yeah, that's an interesting point that you raised about like presenting how you want. And it does kind of add a whole new meaning to this idea of bringing your whole self to work. But also, it's like a mask. It's we talk about masking, and it's a literal digital mask. So that's interesting, and that creates maybe a barrier between you and your colleagues if if you're presenting yourself in a certain way.
Exactly. But on the other hand, we always have a particular mask, right? We always, whether we are fully aware or not, we're always engaging in some kind of impressions management. And then on LinkedIn, what I'm going to say on LinkedIn is going to be very different to what I'm going to say with a colleague, behind closed doors when we're gossiping and all, which we never do. And there's always some kind of impressions management. I do think that it's very interesting that the metaverse gives us this ability to transcend a certain physical appearance, and there's something very interesting there. I don't know, if most workplace will actually enable people to be their whole self or who they think they are inside all the time. And it's also very political. It depends a lot on the context of the organization. It depends on the context of the society at a particular moment in time. So there are many things, not just the technology, but there's something very interesting about this.
Yeah, definitely. So I mean, in your paper you talk about mattering in the metaverse, and I just want to hear more about what does that mean?
Yeah, I find mattering to be a very interesting concept in my work, and you mentioned my first foray into Delve. So thank you for having me again. I've long been very interested in questions of identity at work. Who I am and how who I am relates to what I do. I found these questions very interesting. But over the years, especially as there have been so many controversies around work and what it means to work today, and with transformation of the workplace and transformation of work with technologies, including AI, and this idea that what we do is changing and maybe we should disconnect our identity from work. So I've started to maybe think a bit more deeply about what it means to be at work. And I realized that maybe it's not just a question of what it means to be at work, but it also means being recognized and having a feeling that what we do is valued and matters. And I think this is a very interesting issue that in management research, we don't necessarily delve too much into, or at least not enough from my perspective. And in a way, a lot of human resources management decisions are becoming, and I'm really overgeneralizing. I'm so sorry for human resources managers all over the world. So, but this is an overgeneralization. But in some way, the idea is, you have better data, you can make better decisions, and you are, in a way, we are, equating data with people. And so I'm just an entry point. And this is very different from mattering, because mattering is a sense of actually feeling valued and recognized, so that I, Emma, or you, Eric, at work would be recognized for what you do, and not just for, here is the work that you did today. And I think there's a very interesting tension with digital technologies, which is they make people work more productively. Usually they increase the intensity of the work, and they make us all work, I want to say, better. Debatable, but lots of questions about this, so question mark all over. But they change the work that we do, but they also tend to datify everything. And I think we need to make it sure that we take in consideration mattering.
Yeah. So I guess there's mattering in terms of the work that you do, and then there's a mattering of like just as a person.
Exactly.
Like, if if a family member passes away, like should feel safe enough to be able to ask your supervisor or your HR representative to take time off. But how does something like that work in the metaverse?
Yeah, so exactly, and this is where the tension really shows up very acutely, because again, with the metaverse, suddenly, everybody is visible, which is both amazing because everybody is technically on the same level, it's greater access. If I do a good job, you should be able to recognize it. At the same time, a lot of, the hierarchies, the social dynamics also get reproduced very, very fast.
Right.
And if there is some kind of way in which my work is not recognized, or I do feel that my work is not recognized, it's actually going to be anti-mattering instead of mattering. And my fear with the metaverse is that with the metaverse, there is great visibility of work and workers, but this visibility of work and workers can turn into surveillance rather than mattering. So, it's a data point rather than Eric as a person at work doing a good job and feeling that is recognized.
Yeah, right. So because I'm working in a digital space, like every single action that I take is being tracked and documented and sent to my supervisor so they can tell how productive I'm being. But that's not necessarily the same as my supervisor walking up to me and being like, hey, you did a great job on that story last week. Like, you should feel good about that. That's really interesting.
And I think your example is excellent. And it really shows that obviously I'm a professor in information systems. I am not a technophobe. I am not a Luddite. And there's nothing wrong with them either. But I'm very interested in the technology aspect and the innovation aspect, but these are not just technological issues. These are organizational issues. These are management issues. And I think the combination of management and technology is where a lot of the sticky points are.
Yeah. And I think too, just about I grew up on video games, and when I was young, online gaming was just becoming a thing. And I found a lot of community there, which is interesting. And contrary to what my parents might have thought, these were real friends of mine. And so there can be a real social depth to these online spaces. It does make me wonder about how that might translate into other areas such as workplaces.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think right now it doesn't fully translate because again the uses of metaverses tend to be very situated, training, onboarding, complex collaboration. But we can imagine a case where more readily available immersive platforms becomes the norm in some companies, not in all companies. In some companies, especially, you can imagine a company that has offices in multiple locations for different reasons, and people cannot be at the office or are not at the office. This could be a way to actually develop social bonds with colleagues. And younger generations grow up with, gaming and having all of these social aspect around gaming, around all of these, virtual platforms. They know how to do this. Other generations do not have this instinct yet. Doesn't mean they cannot have it, but they do not have it yet. So, if I were to make a prediction, and always a bad idea to do in the tech world, but if I were to make a prediction, I would imagine that the more social aspects of working with immersive technologies will arrive because new generations are coming.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Wow. You talked about the future and how hard it is to predict, and I think Mark Zuckerberg learned that. He had a big lesson in that very recently. So just for anyone who's watching or listening or who doesn't know, Facebook Meta has pretty significantly just shut down their metaverse program, and they were they reoriented their whole company around this. So it's so I'm curious, given that news and just sort of where the metaverse is now, and it sounds like it's being applied in very specific use cases. But where do you see it going now?
Yeah. So again, would not divine the future with technology. So it's a fool's errand. But, obviously, Meta made a big bet onto the metaverse. The bet didn't fully pan out. The, workforce was, removed, diminished, and then the program really drastically reduced. It doesn't mean that immersive platforms are not going to continue being developed and continue being used, because again, these situated uses are very useful. And also technology keeps on changing and evolving and becoming more and more sophisticated. So I think in 20 years, are we all going to be communicating and working only through metaverse? Probably not. So I don't want to make a prediction, but this seems fairly safe. But is there going to be more uses of immersive platforms in 20 years? Yes, probably. And they will become part of I assume they are likely to become a part of the day-to-day fabric of work for some type of work, for some type of task. And the last thing I'll say in this regard is most big technologies, like the big technologies that are changing the way we see the world and the way we work. And AI is a great example. Take decades. The idea of AI is, of course, way older than just a few decades. But, the practical development of AI took at least 50 to 60 years to get to the point that it is now. And now it's evolving at, such a high and speed. But metaverse are still baby technologies in this regard. 2 years ago, if we had this conversation, I would have had a completely different answer. I would have told you, people don't have legs. It's the uncanny valley all the way through. 2 years later, it's still the case a little bit, but the improvement in the technique is incredible. So in 20 years, in 5, 10, 15, 20 years, things are going to continue to improve.
Yeah, definitely. And I wonder if there's an opportunity here for smaller developers to take this technology forward, without a giant behemoth like Meta behind pushing the technology. It's now you can get these smaller companies to create these more specific use cases for, but do you have any sense of where that's going?
I think this is exactly where it is likely to go. I think Meta went really big on the metaverse. The current situation is not very successful, and that was very hyped. So the shutdown or the drastic slow of the reality labs is very visible and people talk a lot about it. So trying to be too big too fast is unlikely to work. But because these situated uses have been so successful, if I was to advise a small development company, I would say try to find a use case for the metaverse, for an immersive platform that is not completely developed yet, and start small and get from there. So we know training for doctors, training for pilots, trainings, onboarding, meetings, that is covered. There must be another situated use. I do believe probably that, the social aspect, things that you mentioned, that you grew up with video games, that there was a social element. It should not be too hard to replicate within the workplace. And then you get a new dimension to how you interact at work with immersive technology. So if I was to make a bet, that would probably be there.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Well, maybe next time we talk, it'll be through through an immersive platform.
Looking forward to it.
The Metaverse podcast. Let's you heard it here first. Cool. Well, Professor Emma Vaast, thank you so much. This is really fascinating stuff. And for anyone who wants to read your paper, I'm going to put a link in the show notes so they can go check it out. It's a very fascinating read. Highly recommend it. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode. That was my conversation with Professor Emma Vaast, a professor of information systems and the Associate Dean of Research here at the Dicaire Faculty of Management at McGill University. If you want to read more on this topic, you can read Emma's paper at the link in the show notes. Highly recommend checking it out. And if you like learning about tech and its management implications, go visit the Delve website. That's delve.mcgill.ca. We've covered cryptocurrencies, we've covered AI in healthcare, we've covered content moderation on online platforms. So I'm going to leave links to each of these topics for you to go check out. So Delve is the official thought leadership platform of the Desautels Faculty of Management at McGill University. My name is Eric Dicaire. I'm Delve's managing editor, and I was your host today. Professor Saku Montara is Delve's editor-in-chief, and he produced all of our original music. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we will catch you in the next one.